Are we live? Grade school? Are you there? There's always this weird interval where I'm being told that I'm live, but I don't actually see my image in the live stream. There we go. Now I know I'm live. What's up, color people? What's up, color ninjas? Happy Friday to you guys. How the heck are you? I'm doing pretty good over here. I've been playing around with color stuff, doing some client-facing color grading work, and also, as always, working on tools and workflows and systems in the background in between those things, and having a blast with it. Some of it I'm doing with my dude Gadali, who's here with me to help me get questions answered. What's going on, Gadali?
Good morning.
And for this week, everybody, Gadali's voice will be sadly difficult or impossible to hear, so you'll have to do without the warmth of his presence here. But I'm going to try to remember to repeat questions as we go. If I'm forgetting to do that, then Gadali, you can remind me, and no one else will hear it anyway. So actually, you can tell me anything you want. You can tell me nuclear secrets, and probably they'll stay safe between us because
Oh boy.
yeah, it's a whole thing. Okay, Chris says he actually can hear you, so okay, we'll make that work.
I won't give you anything too secret.
So no, skip the nuclear secrets. We'll have our in our post game and our debrief. You can give those to me then.
Great.
Cool, guys. I'm pretty excited about this week's topic. I'm a little bit nervous about this week's topic because I cannot prove to you that anything I'm about to tell you in the next hour or anything that I told you in this week's pre-recorded video is right. All it is about a preferential reproduction of an image, about reimagining the image, as I talked about in the pre-recorded video. And of course, we're talking about day for night, and in particular, a day for night treatment on images that may have been shot with that intent in camera or may not have been shot with that intent, and how we can make that work in a variety of cases. As I said in this week's pre-recorded video, it's a huge topic. I've thought about it a ton. I've played with it a ton. My thinking and my tools have evolved with it over time. So I just want to emphasize that even more so than in an average Friday morning episode of Grade School, you shouldn't take me as an authority on this, because day for night is, again, as I said in the pre-recorded video, it's about a feeling. It's not about an exact reproduction of something, because if we precisely reproduce night with no artificial illumination, then we're likely not to be able to see anything. So we're in the realm of feel. We're in the realm of the subjective. I'm going to give you my principles, my practices, my techniques that have served me well in that area when it comes to day for night. You are more than welcome to find better principles or practices, or to say, Cullen's crazy, I think that looks terrible, I don't love that. It's all fair play. But regardless, we're going to have lots of fun exploring the subject. It's one of my favorite aesthetics in all of motion imaging. If you go back and look at golden age of Hollywood, when they're like, we don't have fast enough film to expose an actual night exterior, so we're going to shoot this in the day or in the afternoon or at dusk. We're going to talk briefly today at some point probably about dusk for night. Also one of my favorite looks. Tough to pull off, but boy, does it look good when it's done right. So lots and lots to chop up. I'm really, really fascinated by this subject and excited to hear y'all's questions and kind of talk about where you're coming from and how you think about it as well. While everyone is getting a chance to build up some of their questions, I thought it might be kind of fun to start with something different than I typically do. I'm going to show you guys some shots from a film that I actually shot. Now, oh goodness, this has been 10 years ago now. I shot this back in 2013. This is a project that I shot on film that had a big climactic ending fight scene at the end of this short film that we were doing that was set in the woods at night. And we shot it day for night. And I thought we could start by taking a look at some of those images and just talking about it. So here's like the first opening shot of that sequence in the film. And I'm having extra fun in here because I've got lights on so that you guys can see me. And I'm going to be looking at very dark images. So I may struggle a little bit, as I did with recording this week's video, but we'll find our way. So, if I just play through this, no guarantee it'll play in real time, but this is a day for night exposure that we shot. And really all we did, we were not experts in this, but we understood the technique and we knew what we wanted to do. So we picked out a canopied environment without too much like direct hard sunlight that would be difficult to work with. And we pulled exposure. And maybe the other significant ingredient to call out is that we shot tungsten film in daylight so that we would just naturally get this cooler palette. This, by the way, has had no grade performed on it whatsoever. This is just day for night as intended and captured in camera. And look at that cool gag where the guy jumps out with a knife. This is a pretty cool scene, I think. Oh, you're not?
Nope.
Sorry, guys.
Sounds cool though.
Sounds great. Now I've got to actually make good on the promise. Well, in fairness, Gadali, you probably were seeing the little bit of my client monitor that I wasn't covering up. Isn't that good enough?
I can see a little bit of it, and you know what? It did it for me.
All right. Okay, I think this is the part where Sam would tell me that Mercury is in retrograde, and that's why I'm having so much trouble with my technology today. Hang tight. So not this. How do I show you what I see? There we go. There we go. Okay. Take two. So as I said, day for night scene. I'm going to show you the first kind of opening tracking shot from this sequence. It's not going to play quite in real time, but you'll get the idea. And again, just to recap, we shot this in the middle of the day. This was, probably, noon or 1 or 2 or whenever we managed to get this shot off that we did this. We're on dolly track. It's a canopied environment that we selected intentionally. We pulled exposure, I want to say 2 stops in camera so that we would already be in a decent ballpark. And then we shot tungsten film as opposed to daylight film, which would have been appropriate for this condition. And now you can see the gag that I got really excited about a moment ago that made you go, well, what the hell are you talking about? It happens in just a moment here as this character is wandering through the woods. Wait for it. There you go. Not quite as climactic at 13 frames a second, but you get the idea. And this kicks off this really fun fight sequence that we shot. So, this is one example of when we talk about day for night, as I kind of alluded to in this week's video, we're really talking about more than one thing, and we're certainly not just talking about a LUT, even though I do have a power grade that I'm going to share with you guys today that matches what I was working on in this week's pre-recorded video, so you at least have a template or a sort of guide for how to begin doing a day for night look. But in this case, this is day for night as conceived in camera, and exposure was compensated as a result of that intent. And we also shot a mismatch in film sensitivity, as I said. So this is one potential example of day for night. And again, this is no grading whatsoever. This is just color managed film neg. And just as a quick start, let's just try out. I promise you I haven't done this. I'm doing this totally blind. Let's see how well my day for night look functions on this material. So the first thing I'm going to need to do, this is, I don't know if it's a bug in Resolve 18 or if it's something that would never work, but I've got a patch that doesn't quite connect up here. So this is the same power grade that I'm going to give to you guys. In this case, because exposure was pulled in camera, I'm actually going to reset my exposure pull like so, or maybe, just like reset it and then do quite a bit less of it. And so here's like now a day for night look applied to this film neg, which I think actually holds up pretty well as a starting point, right? By the time we get that exposure dialed in, I've got this contrast node where you can, open up or deepen your shadows, your highlights as you want to. This is sort of a variation on the template node graph that you normally see me working with. And then something else that you might not need on every shot, but it's good to have slotted in here that actually is putting in work in this shot, is a sky adjustment. Why is that affecting my image thusly? Oh, it's because of my layer node. Okay, so this is just kind of knocking down where sky likely would be if there were sky in a frame, which there happens to be here. And I think I like what I'm seeing here. So this is just another module or a component of a day for night look that you can strengthen, you can weaken, you can turn off, you can turn on, but the idea is that it's a sort of component that's there in place for you to take advantage of. So this is that day for night power grade just sort of slotted onto the image without much adjustment besides exposure. And that's sort of my intent for you, is that, that the power grade gives you that kind of good starting point for the image. I'm going to turn my window outline off on my reference monitor so I'm not distracted by it. And the other thing that I'll point out, just to kind of guide you through this node tree, which there will be a link to in today's description if you want to grab it. The other thing that I thought was kind of cool that I sort of added on to after recording this week's video is I've got this subject layer node right here. Now let me explain what's happening here. Right now, there's nothing happening. But as we talked about in this week's pre-recorded video, one of the challenges with day for night is it doesn't just need to look like night, we have to be able to see, right? And we not only need to be able to see, we need to be able to see what is important in the frame, which is going to be our subject, right? So my idea here is I've got this stock power window drawn that you're in almost all cases going to need to shape and reposition in order to actually, like target whatever your subject is. And let's say for the sake of example that I have drawn this window and I've gone ahead and tracked it to move with my subject throughout. Right now, this window, this layer is doing nothing at all. But what you have here, if you go to your key output gain, which I've currently got set to, or it is set to near 0, if you have it at 0, it's truly doing nothing. And as you start to increase that, you're going to see just inside of that window that you are diminishing the effect of everything else that you've done up above. Does that make sense? It's a little weird, but the idea is that up here, okay, I'm pulling exposure, I'm adjusting contrast, I'm adding a sky window, I'm doing all this stuff that is going to help this particular shot start to feel hopefully more like a night scene. All that I'm doing with this subject window by increasing my key output gain is zeroing out that adjustment within the confines of my window. So this can be a really nice way of getting your overall frame to a place where it's feeling properly weighted, properly nightish, and then simply drawing a window or repositioning this window around your subject, tracking it if you need to, and then very subtly. I mean, this is like not the best actual example image because exposure actually already is pulled. But if we move over to, like let's go over to this shot, for example, and do our day for night look here. And I'm just going to kind of compensate my exposure like so that it's got some kind of appropriate measure of weight to it. And then I can go down here to my subject and just ever so slightly increase this key output gain and turn this off and on. I've basically done a power window and picked them up in the same way that I might normally go like, oh, let's add a power window and pick them back up. But in this case, we're not doing a thing and then stacking up a sort of conflicting adjustment on top of that. Rather, we're creating a holdout of about 16% within the confines of this window that allows you to preserve a bit of the actual healthier exposure that you may want for the important parts of your frame. So I thought that was kind of a fun tweak that I've done before that I didn't demonstrate in this week's pre-recorded video, but I thought might be helpful for you guys in this PowerGrade. And by the way, it does seem to be, it's a bug that we've kind of semi-confirmed. When you import this PowerGrade, you may find that this bottom branch is disconnected like so. And if so, you're going to get odd results. So if you see this when you initially import this PowerGrade, just reconnect this up to the head of the node graph and you'll be in good shape. And then over here, this is exactly what we talked about in this week's video. We're just softening the heck out of those shadows so that as we approach 0 and as we expose down, we're holding out those very bottom code values and keeping them from crashing too hard into the floor. And then we've got our cooling thing over here, which I like doing in curves, because I can kind of do it subtractively, but also because I can do this sort of like, you could think of this as like a kind of like floor weighted gamma adjustment, if you want to call it that, because that's really where the meat of my image is now living after I've made these exposure adjustments. So that's a quick look at some actual day for night acquired material and a quick tour of the PowerGrade that is available to you guys if you want to download them in the link that's provided in the description for today's session. Gadali, how we doing out there? Do we have questions yet?
We do have a few questions coming in.
Tell me.
Let's see. David is asking a question on day for night involving compositing. Would the RGB mixer set to mono with the layer node into your grade allow for potentially more flexibility in moving the grade, depending on where it's put, of course?
I suppose that's possible. If you're talking about like actually, monoing the image. So what David is asking about is over here in my RGB mixer, if I turn this into monochrome mode, and then, like you can basically control your weights of your image like so. That could be a potentially useful technique. That could be a fun way of controlling saturation potentially. And then, maybe you could even do this. Again, like I'm going to be more receptive to ideas and exploration today than normal because the short answer to David's question is like, yeah, if it works, you should absolutely do that because nobody can tell you that you're wrong because we're literally just engaged in an imaginative exercise. So I'm doing this all out of order, but let's just say we did that monochrome thing initially. I'm going to kind of just by eye expose down and then add another serial node. And let's just start to cool things off. Like that might be kind of interesting to introduce, this is like a very like pure blue wash that's in my image. So it's still monochrome. It's just skewed, kind of blue cyan. as opposed to what we were working with. Let's like grab a still of this, as opposed to what we were working with a moment ago, where we are aggressively dragging the balance toward blue cyan, but there actually is still color. You can still see like this monk's like red garment. So, you know, and I just made a very quick job of that in this other instance, but maybe that's kind of interesting to get more of a monochrome thing. I'll certainly say if we do look at some principles that we can adhere to or exploit when we're doing day for night, if we think about the biology of the human eye is made up of rods and cones. Those are the two photo receptors that we have. We have way more rods than cones, which we've talked about in prior episodes of grade school as relates to contrast in general, because rods are responsible for the perception of luminance and contrast, while cones are responsible for the perception of color. As we move into lower illumination situations, our cones basically start to shut off, and we start to rely on them less and less, and we start to rely on our rods more and more, which is one of the reasons why we tend to grade day for night images with a sort of blue washy feel, and also why, you know, like this is something, I mean, I'm going to go way into like woo-woo land with you guys for a second. I want you to try an exercise tonight. When you go to sleep, when you lie down, try to lie down with the intent of having a dream about a moonlit scene. See if you can like sort of provoke that dream in yourself. And when you do, pay attention. What does it look like? What does your imagination tell you a moon exterior scene looks like? Because that's really what we're talking about for all of this day for night material. And if you can conjure that in your dreams, or in simpler terms, if you can just conjure it in your waking mind, what does that look like to you? I can't tell you what that looks like to you, but I can tell you what it looks like to me. And for me, it indeed has a cool monochrome quality. And I think that can be somewhat explained. My image there, and the fact that others seem to share that image, can be somewhat explained by our biology, which relies more and more on our rods. As the levels of light get lower and lower, we tend to perceive a much more sort of, like monochrome, less colorful image. But back to David's original question about using the RGB mixer in monochrome mode and playing with its placement in the node graph. I think that would be a really fun thing to experiment with your day for night look, for sure.
And question from Jim on a related note. I have always worried about saturation on a day for night because we don't see saturation the same in the dark. Is saturation not a concern for you? I think meaning that you haven't touched the saturation knob in your flow so far.
Yeah, great question. So I'm paranoid. I want to make sure everyone's hearing the question itself. But just to summarize, Jim is asking about the role of saturation in a day for night look, and whether that's something that I should potentially be touching in this, or if it's something that I would think about in a normal day for night process. And I would say yes. Like that kind of tees off of what I was just talking about, of like we're going to perceive less colorfulness, less color separation in particular when it comes to night scenes. So it sort of depends on how you think about saturation, which has a slippery definition. But for me, this is where like the imaginative part comes into play. Like this is probably not super true to what it actually looks like if I'm standing in this vantage at midnight on a full moon. I'm probably not going to perceive this much blue, or this much of this kind of like bluish cyan that I have here in the image. However, I think it's kind of pretty. So that's another thing sort of to weigh, like that I would think about. Like you could definitely make a case for really controlling saturation to get more of a monochrome, like true to human biology rendering. You could also say, who the heck cares? I just think it's beautiful like this. I mean, I think about like some of my favorite, like night work is in like The Sound of Music when, is it Gerda? I can't remember her name. I think it's Gerda. Sings that very problematic duet with her boyfriend, who turns out to be a Nazi, that has really aged poorly. But the actual images look amazing, where they're standing in that greenhouse and it's supposedly sort of a moon illuminated scene. And it's just like this beautiful, hyper rich, deep blue that has probably very little to do with the way that scene would actually look if you were standing there. But it looks great, and it's clear to us what it's supposed to be. So I think that's another great example of kind of dealer's choice, like whatever works for you. And I would say, kind of rounding things out, if I did want to control my sat, my go-to would probably be to use like a sat versus sat adjustment here. and just look at like, all right, first of all, you're going to be dealing with lower sat in general, but I would do some kind of sat versus sat curve like this and just look at sort of applying a, global control there like so. And this certainly would not be a crazy thing to consider doing. You can probably see it more in my vector scope than in my image. And the fact that I can push this hard without seeing much result also tells me that, I've already done what to me is maybe a bigger thing than dealing with saturation is dealing with separation. Like a night exterior is going to have very low separation for sure. And to me, if it has high separation, but no artificial light that would be creating that separation, that to me does feel visually ambiguous. It will be confusing to me as to whether I'm truly looking at a night exterior. So I'm generally just by instinct going to find my way to a lower separation. But the saturation component, like you can see, I'm already, by virtue of the fact that I'm driving my sat versus sat this hard, and that I don't see that much difference in my image. I do see a difference for sure now that I'm really hitting this hard, but I can sort of infer from this exercise like, okay, I must have actually, functionally, perceptually, pretty low saturation already actually, that, is due to the fact that this isn't making a huge difference. But great question to ask, great thing to play with, and I think a great thing to sort of have a creative take on of like, no, I really want to control my sat, or I want to let the sat go wild in one direction, in the direction of like my cyan blues over here, or even more extremely, to go back to David's question, I'm going to suck all the color out of the image and then wash it all in that direction. That's kind of a fun question. Like at that point, is that a saturated image? Not really, because it's monochrome. It just happens to be skewed toward blue cyan. So more thoughts for you. Hope that's interesting, or at least stimulates the imagination a little bit.
Similarly, Heinz is asking, does consideration have to be put into which color tones desaturate first as exposure decreases, or are there desaturation adjustments made to specific tones more than others?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's another great thing to think about, that like, here would be my take. My take is that you could absolutely think about things in that way, that like, okay, I'm going to basically prioritize desaturating everything, sort of like I'm going to try to leave or enhance the strength of my vectors down here in my lower right quadrant, and everywhere else I'm going to really seek to like diminish or pull out the color value there, just as a sort of convention of the way we think of moonlight. You could make that case. My contention would be that that's basically what I've done here with just a simple RGB curves adjustment. Now, again, that's for us each to determine as individual artists, and you could very reasonably say, well, in addition to or instead of this kind of cooling operation that I'm doing, I could go in and I could say, well, let's look at like a hue versus sat and just start to pull everything down that's not cyan or blue, and see how that feels to you. Maybe that feels really great. That would basically be sort of an alternative to the RGB mixer monochrome mode idea that we were exploring a couple minutes ago. And maybe within this, I'm going to let green kind of taper a little bit, maybe leave a little bit of magenta, and then maybe we could go like crazy with cyan and blue and really boost those up. I mean, that looks kind of batty, to be honest with you. But, like you could almost treat this like an audio EQ exercise and see what kind of results you can get out of it this way. Like, I don't know, maybe that's interesting. It's going to depend on the image, and it's going to depend on your palette. But like short answer, yeah, I would definitely think about like saturation of particular image hues changing at a different rate than others. But that also is ultimately kind of a fancy way of talking about separation, because if you're diminishing the amount of color contrast, you have lower separation, which is often what we're thinking about or what we're itching for when we're talking about saturation, as we've talked about before. But another fruitful avenue of exploration for sure, I would say.
Question from Zizo that's about the production side. What would be the best time to shoot for the light for day for night?
Dusk. Dusk is going to have like, the best time to shoot would be in about a 10-minute window in twilight, where you've got healthier stop. You don't have to ask as much of your lens and your sensor, but you've got that same quality, that same sort of like sourceless quality that is one way of getting a day for night look. This is another fun thing to think about. If you look at like night for night work, especially like from the 90s and early 2000s, the solution to night for night in that era seemed to generally be, oh, the moon is an 18K behind that tree. Okay, that's interesting. I suppose that could be a thing, but that's kind of the stock take in night for night, is you've actually got this very hard, very sourcey, very powerful light that is just outside of the frame or just outside of visibility. And then they'll kind of fill that in so that there's a little bit happening in areas where that light's not directly illuminating things. But another way that you could think about like night work which is more of like what we got in, these frames from my little short film that I was showing you guys. There are some, like actually in this shot, you can see there's like a little glint of sunlight, which I actually don't mind at all. I think that's kind of cool. And I think like with the right grade and with the right, like imagination to say like, oh, I know that was the sun, but if I'm doing this right, the viewer may feel like it's the moon. Like setting those hard kicks aside, in general, the quality of this here, what I like most about these images probably is if we zoom in, like, let me actually turn this gallery off for a minute and get things a little bit bigger for you guys. Like that's a very, very soft directionless light. Like there's just a little bit of kind of like a Paramount butterfly thing happening there. So that's what you'll get if you shoot at dusk. You'll get this very directionless kind of magic ambient light that gives your sensor and your lens a better chance of capturing a healthy exposure, but in a way that feels quite consistent with one idea for the way like a night exterior sort of subjectively feels. And just to give a visual example of that, that's kind of why I pulled in some of these shots, because these shots would be very easy to go day for night with, or to go dusk for night with, I should say, because they're already so darn dark, Like all it's really a question of, let me just zero out this contrast adjustment and, kind of look at exposing down to something like this, and then maybe go over to my contrast and pull some gain like that, maybe compensate a little bit in the shadows. And I'm writing, especially in my room that is lit right now, I'm on that knife edge of like what's visible and what's a healthy signal, but that's reasonable to me, somewhere around there. And then if I kind of play with the intensity and the positioning of my sky adjustment here, and just to go on a tangent here, let me try something for you guys. This kind of goes back to our qualifier conversation from last week. I'm just going to go into my qualifier here, and I'm going to try something out here. I'm going to see if I can't sweep my luminance and sort of leave her out of the bargain, like so. So I've still got this grad that's just on the sky. I'm just opening, I'm qualifying I'm excluding luminance values of a certain, until they get to a certain strength, they're being left out of the deal. So I'm just going to do this a little bit further, try to get it nice and clean. I mean, there should be decent separation, as I'm finding here, between my subject and the sky. And that doesn't look awesome. So let's just try finessing that. And so now, if I turn that node off and on, my idea was to have more effect on the sky than on her. I'm not so sure that I pulled it off, but it was worth a try. But in any case, I like what it's doing on the sky. And, like this would be kind of like fine-tuning this power grade for this particular shot. And I'm just going to keep playing with my softness until I get it somewhere that I like and try not to hit her too much. So this would be kind of a dusk for night grade, if that makes sense. We're going from here to there. And that's starting to feel pretty darn good to me. Maybe I would do another vignette on the bottom or swap out that sky grad for a vignette around the whole frame, or do a vignette in addition to that sky grad. It's all fair play. Whatever looks good is fair play. And then lastly, we could do this little holdout node thing that I showed you guys before, and just look at adding a little bit of key output gain, like so, just to sort of fill her back in, or like sort of weight the grade to happen more around her than it does inside of the frame contents here. So that would be this is a very long answer to a dusk for night, or to what I would think of as the ideal lighting conditions for shooting day for night. That would be at dusk. Of course, the challenge is dusk lasts for like 10 minutes, and before that it's going to be brighter and harder, and after that then you're really into night and you're not getting any of the benefit of getting a more healthy level to your exposure.
Let's see. Borjan is asking or saying that they've done some tests on infrared images for day for night, and it's complicated and time consuming. And I wonder if there's an easier way to get a similar infrared feeling.
Yeah, it's interesting you bring that up. I actually just saw a link this morning to an article I haven't even read that apparently for Jordan Peele's new film Nope, which I haven't seen yet, for the night work, which they did night for night, if I'm remembering correctly, they used two cameras, one of which was sensitized to the infrared register, if I'm getting that right. And to try to, I'm assuming to try to get a thicker negative, to try to get more stimulus onto the sensor, even under lower lighting conditions. So in terms of like how you might simplify that approach to capturing and availing yourself of infrared, it's really a hardware problem. What's interesting is that most camera sensors today, all CMOS sensors, which are the sensors in Reds and Aries and, like any professional cinema camera, they actually are already sensitive to the infrared range, but they have something called an OLPF, an optical low pass filter in them that essentially knocks down that stimulus before it ever hits the sensor. So you really need to deal with things at that link in the chain, because once you've put that, once you've dammed the river, then you're not going to get as much water on the other side of it until you go upstream and you open the dam, if that makes sense. So that would be, I don't know if there's a way to avail yourself of infrared ranges of the spectrum in an image capture when you've got an OLPF on there that is actively impeding that stimuli from actually hitting the sensor in the first place.
Let's see. Praveen wonders, when attempting a day for night, how do we make sure that we can pass QC in terms of crushed shadows?
Oh, that's a good question. So, I've actually been wanting to talk with you guys about QC a little bit in general. So I'll go on a hopefully brief tangent about QC. QC, you really shouldn't be aiming at QC ever. First of all, clipped highlights, clipped shadows, that stuff should be handled in a reasonable baseline way by your color management and by your good practices and by the fact that you as the artist don't want to slam into the edges of your display's capability because it doesn't look good. Okay. So I would say if you grade a day for night and you like it and your client likes it and it looks good and you get a QC flag that says, hey, you're clipping your shadows, my response would be creative intent. That you can always invoke that. And you can't invoke it if it's like, hey, you have a dead pixel in there. You can't say it was my creative intent to have a dead pixel, generally speaking. But if that truly is your creative intent to have the shadows positioned where they are, then that's exactly what you should say, and you should be able to get that, that QC note sort of neutralized as a result. So I would not aim at QC and don't feel beholden to QC. You're the image masterer. You're the person who is supposed to help determine the final rendering of the image, of course, in partnership with the filmmakers and the image creators. So if you guys are happy as a unit in the room, QC doesn't get a vote. They can tell you you've got a dead pixel, or I can see a C-stand or something like that, but they don't get to say you need to soften the toe of your shadows if you like how they look now. So that's my answer to that question, but also to a more general question that I feel like has been coming up a lot lately. Do not aim at QC. Don't invite them into the party. They're just there to help you make sure that the viewer experience is consistent with your creative intent and isn't compromised by mistakes. But if something's not a mistake, then you shouldn't fix it.
The VDAP is wondering, why you're using a layer node in the node tree. What's the advantage of doing it that way?
Oh, so in this case, it's just the appropriate tool. It's doing what I want when a parallel mixer would not. So in this case, the layer node is literally taking the original image state and I am layering it on top only on the basis of the contents of this window. So it's just the appropriate tool. A parallel mixer would do something different and something that I don't want. What I want in this case explicitly is to stack up some percentage, in this case right now, 42% of the original image over top of the treatment that I have come up with in nodes 1, 3, and 5, if that makes sense. So it's just a different tool with a different intent than a parallel node. This is not like a secondary that I'm wanting to sort of blend into or incorporate into the image. This is something that I want to take visual priority. I want it to null out anything underneath anywhere where it's present. So like just as a silly example, if I did a really tight power window in here on my subject's face and I do something loony, like push it to some crazy red color like that, when I have my key output gain at 100% here, you're not going to see that adjustment at all, assuming that the window is large enough. Right now, the softness is such that it's actually feathering in and allowing some of that bottom layer to punch through. But that's the idea there. Although actually, interestingly, I'm still seeing just a hair of that. And I am in I'm in a layer mixer node there. It may just be a question that I've gone too soft. Yeah, so like this is, I'm officially like mocking up this example, but you can see in a sort of like experimental scenario, anything inside of the inner contents of this window is completely superseding the underlying layer. A parallel mixer would do something different. So it's just a question of intent.
Uliana is wondering, in the pre-recorded video, you were using the offset wheel to dial the exposure, but why not the HDR version, since it's meant to be color aware and be closer to exposure in camera?
Yeah, that's a good question. I'm going to put it to you guys this way. There's a cost benefit to like adding things to your toolkit. So what I teach here on the channel, because you guys are coming from a variety of experience levels and backgrounds, and you're at different points in your color grading journey, I try to teach something that works best for the greatest number of people. So here would be my contention. Offset versus HDR wheels exposure. 99 out of 100 times. Show me, okay, here's an exposure pull with offset. Here's an equivalent exposure pull with the HDR global wheel. 99 out of 100 times. Give me a blind taste. I cannot tell the difference unless you're showing me which one is which inside of Resolve. As a result, I am hesitant to recommend introducing a whole new palette into your workflow for the negligible benefit of a single wheel. Now, if you are like me and you really care about the details and about doing things exactly right, you will probably eventually find your way over to the global exposure wheel, as it sounds like you have, by way of the question that you're asking. And in fact, you'll probably even go even further than that, as I have, and say, well, it turns out that this is a more photometric and more precise application of exposure, but it's still not quite right. And you'll go as far as building up your own tool for getting the most photometric exposure adjustment that you possibly can. But it's a question of cost benefit. Like the costs that it took me to get to that layer that I'm at now, like, oh, I have a custom tool that does exactly what I want 100 out of 100 times. For most of us, unless you're, like color grading all day, every day, and working with the clients that I'm working with, the juice is not worth the squeeze in general. I don't mean that to say your work is any less important than mine. I mean that you need to prioritize sensibly. So this is not something that is going to, I talk about this in my book, The Colorist 10 Commandments, greatest gains for least efforts. This is nominal gains, minor gains for significant efforts. So it's sort of the opposite of what I teach in that chapter, where I say you should be looking for what's the next biggest thing that I can change in the tools that I'm using to get a big increase in the quality of my work or in the efficiency of my work. So you could switch over to, this is a long way of saying, go use the global exposure wheel if you want to, if you're aware of that existing and it doesn't overwhelm you. But it's not something I'm generally going to lead with and teach with, because it's just adding another entire palette to the toolkit without really netting much tangible benefit.
Let's see. Takedown is wondering, when working with dark shots, do you have any tips on reducing banding or compression artifacts?
Yeah, I'm glad we asked that about, like compression, artifacting, banding, etc. with dark shots that you're trying to give a treatment with. I think the biggest one would go back to our video on noise reduction a couple weeks ago. Lower your expectations. Do less. If the image is, like 3 stops under, instead of trying to get it to 0 stops under, try to get it to 1.5 stops under or 2 stops under. Just don't push it so hard. And this is actually something, again, a tangent that I've been wanting to, something I've been wanting to talk about with you guys for a while. This lower your expectations mantra that I invoke a lot here on the channel. I just want to like talk about that philosophy for a second, because it seems like cheating to say, well, if you can't hit a target, just move the goalposts, right? That's sort of the intuition of like, well, that's not functional advice. Why are you giving that to me? Here's what I would say in a nutshell. High expectations are good if they result in a better result, if they net you a better result. High expectations are bad if they end up with you hating yourself and not getting a better result, right? Or doing something really, really ridiculous and unsound because you are insisting that you must get to the bar of your expectations. So that's really the spirit of what I mean when I say lower your expectations. I don't just mean, oh, take it easy on yourself. What I mean is you will get a better result. Anytime I tell you to lower your expectations, that's not just in the interest of your happiness and well-being. It's also in the interest of getting a better result. So I'm not just saying, oh, be okay with doing worse work. I'm saying you will get better work by lowering that bar. So very much the same case here with noisy, banding, artifacting footage as you try to open it up and counter for exposure mistakes made in camera. Do less. Lower your expectations, and you're going to find that, hey, I can take it so far. I can get 80% of what the client's asking for, or 80% of what I would like to do with this image without incurring the undue cost of artifacts, banding, etc.
DJ asks, how do you incorporate stills from other films to match a grade? For instance, if you find a film that has the look you're going for.
Oh, that's a fun question. So this is one that actually Gadali and I have been working on a little bit. When I have my job folders for my color grading business, one of the stock folders in that template job folder when new jobs get created is a color references folder. Those might be references that I pull. Those might be references that my clients pull, but it's just references that are exactly what we're talking about, where you're saying, hey, there's something I find inspiring in here and pertinent to what we're trying to do. I'll give you the rundown. We could do a whole grade school. In fact, that would be a really good grade school to do, to talk about working with reference images. But the main thing that I try to remember when I'm working with reference images is like, if you show me a frame from Blade Runner and you say, let's make it look like that, I find that visually inspiring. That's useless. That doesn't mean anything. What we have to do, and I'm not saying that's a bad thing, that I'm saying that the work's not done. So if your client brings you a reference or you have something that you want to, borrow from, the very first thing you need to do after selecting that inspiration is you need to get a little more specific and say, okay, well, what do you dig? What are you into in that image? Are you, in the case of Blade Runner, like, do you love Harrison Ford? Because we're not going to be able to superimpose Harrison Ford into your movie, And I know it's a silly example, but it really scales from there to say like, oh, I love like the roll off in those neons. It's like, well, is there neon in your frame? Because if there's not, that really doesn't apply. So you can look at stuff that applies versus things that don't. But ultimately, in doing that, what you want to do is arrive at a maximum of 2 or 3 things that you're like, I'll give you an example. I love the way that the shadows in this particular film feel rich and inky and deep, but they also feel inviting and open, and like there's something in there for me to consume and like sort of bite into, if that makes sense. That's a very abstract verbal description, but that's something that I indeed do say when I look at certain films. I'm like, wow, I really love that. And that abstract quality is something I would love to borrow and introduce into this film. And then we can look at how to imaginatively go about getting that character trait from that set of images meaningfully recreated or reimagined or repurposed into our images. And then you lather, rinse, repeat for those 2 or 3 characteristics. And I limit you to 2 or 3 because you can imagine arriving at what exactly you're seeing, describing it, and figuring out how to reproduce it. That's very time consuming. So you really want to focus on 2 or 3 elements that you find most appealing, most applicable to your images, and focus on those. So in general, we want to move away from the idea of like, I'm going to like hammer this image into the shape of, like this frame from the Joker, or what have you, which, as you guys know, we had my friend Jill Bogdanowicz to talk about grading the Joker here on the show. I think it's a beautiful film, a beautiful grade, but to say I'm going to very, very tightly recreate the aesthetic of that film in my images, that doesn't work. And that's not what Jill was doing when she graded the Joker. She was trying to figure out how to make the Joker look like its best self. So that's what we want to do. And again, my focus on reference images is to find 1, 2, 3 character traits that I want to lift and borrow, and then figure out how I'm going to do that.
Perfect Picture is wondering, how do you plan out and schedule how long you spend on finding the look, and then how long you use on each shot? Where do you begin?
Yes, that's a good question. How do you budget time and sort of plan out your grading process? The biggest thing that I can encourage you with is it just comes down to experience. And the longer you come to understand your process and the craft that you're engaged in, the better you'll get at estimating time and at knowing, all right, we could spend another 10 hours on this look here, but that means we won't have any time left to grade that I know I'm going to need. That just takes experience. But some general principles that you can apply, I'll put it this way. It is not linear at all. So a sort of common metric that I like to throw out to my clients and remind myself of, by the time I am done ingesting your footage, color managing your footage, and getting a look dialed in with you in collaboration with you, that's 80% of what your movie's ever going to look like if it's reasonably well shot. If it's really, really poorly shot, or they've really changed their mind about what they want after the fact, that metric may not hold. But in general, that's kind of my bar. I want to get 80% of the way there. And I don't mean my 80%. I don't mean 80% of the nodes. I don't mean 80% of what I want to do with it. I mean 80% of what the average person who walks in off the street into the cinema is going to pick up on. By the time that look and that color management are set, those top level characteristics, contrast ratio, how thick are the shadows, how creamy are the highlights, how colorful, how cool, how warm, how limited, how saturated, all those things, those are all going to be set by the time that you've got your look established. And that's can either be a good or a terrible thing. If the look is great, then that's awesome. That means you've got a really well-defined track to run on. If the look is not finished, or if the look really disagrees with the creative intent, you're just making more work for yourself in the grade. So that's kind of my general rule of thumb that I apply is I want to get, by the time I've color managed and set a look, which does happen at the outset, I want to be 80% home. And again, 80% home, not by my measure, but by the measure of the average person walking into the cinema off the street for those top level characteristics. So I hope that's some helpful general guidelines.
And a random question. Praveen is loving the Masters of Colors Spotify or the podcast series. Do you plan on doing more episodes?
I'll put it to you guys this way. I am very, very keen to have more conversations of that quality with that caliber of artist. And we're working very hard internally here at my company to figure out what the best version of that looks like. But definitely maybe some version of that soon. I would love to do it. I'm glad you're enjoying those conversations. I had so much fun talking with those artists, some of my absolute favorite colorists, and really glad to get them on record. And actually, just to go on a quick tangent off of that, something I wanted to mention today in terms of inspiration or more fuel for your hopper as you're thinking about day for night. For those of you who haven't checked out that Masters of Color podcast that we're discussing, that's available on Spotify and Apple Podcasts and really anywhere else that you consume podcasts, check out my conversation with Eric White, who is David Fincher's colorist for his last several projects. Eric did one of my favorite day for night grades ever in tight partnership with Eric Messerschmidt, the DP for Mank. If you look at the day for night scene that falls about halfway into the movie Mank, it takes place between Gary Oldman and oh my goodness, what is her name? Gadali, help me. Do you remember her name? The young lady from Mank, the main gal, Amanda Seyfried, however you say that. Takes yeah, thanks, buddy. It takes place between the two of them. It's stunning. It's so beautifully done, and it's actually fascinating. You can go and read up on how it was photographed and how it was graded, and Eric and I talked about it a bunch, including what he calls something really interesting that's completely different from anything that we've done. So his approach, according to our conversation in that Masters of Color episode, was to do what he called a swan curve. And this was just an audio conversation, so it's not like he was demoing stuff at the wheel. But to me, what that means is something roughly like this. So if we sort of like, this is one of my least favorite things about these curves is they start to get really odd when you make more extreme adjustments. But he's talking, you know, you can see this sort of like swan-esque shape that is happening here. So you're sort of like neutral for a certain point, and then you're really dipping in the middle, and then you're climbing back up to peak white at the top there. And I could probably, you know, like another thing that I don't love about these curves is that the swan curve might look different than we would expect because the effective range of this image is not really 0 to 1. But you can kind of get the idea of what he was talking about when he talked about a swan curve. But that was his whole driver of that day for night look, was to create some kind of curve like this. We should get him on grade school sometime and have him demo it for us and talk to us about it if he would be willing. But that was his driver, in the same way that I've been pitching to you, like, hey, here's my driver, here's my template, here's what I'm going to use shot after shot to sort of get a consistent baseline, that being this plus the shot level exposure. Eric's driver apparently was a swan curve. So I just loved that description and thought it was another interesting way of thinking about day for night grading that I hadn't heard about before. So it's kind of a tangent from that question, but it's something I wanted to talk about anyway. Go check out my conversation with Eric White, in which he holds forth on swan curves.
How does day for night work in HDR?
Ooh, that's a juicy question. How does day for night work in HDR? Well, it depends on how you think HDR works. There are different schools of thought on HDR. My personal creative take is that I really don't want to move the body of the image very much when I'm grading HDR. So in terms of like, what value am I going to, if I stick a probe on my reference monitor right now and I probe a patch of mid-gray or a middle exposed face or something like that, what value, just in terms of nits, am I going to get off of that? Take a number. Let's call it, like 8 nits, 10 nits in an SDR context. Now I'm flipping over to HDR. I'm setting HDR. I've got the monitor in HDR mode. Take a reading off of that same thing. What should the value be now? I think it should really not change very much. Maybe a little bit higher, but I really am not interested in seeing it change. I'm not interested in a brighter image in HDR. I'm interested in the opportunity that I may or may not take advantage of to have pingier specular highlights, if that makes sense. So for my way of grading, not that much is going to change, except that my speculars, even in those moonlit scenes, are going to be brighter, which actually can be really, really helpful to create visual interest and engagement and snap in an image, which, like one of the things that we always fight with day for night is there's darkness, but it's also like, a contrast ratio that starts to get really, really low. So HDR can actually be a huge ally when you're doing a quote unquote low contrast scene of any sort, because you've got these peak speculars that can live way up high, almost where they started when you initially began grading, and then everything underneath can be pulled down, and you've got more room in that section of the tone scale to say, hey, do stuff up until this point and then leave that alone. And in fact, that's like kind of the most important aspect of the swan curve that we were talking about, is to say, well, we're dropping, but at a certain point we're saying, just leave it the hell alone and let it go back to, by the time we're back up to the top of the curve, we're actually not moving those peak highlights from where they began. So that's something you can of course do in SDR, but I think it becomes even more of a potential advantage in HDR. So it depends on how you grade, but if you grade like me, it's something that really won't change your process very much. It'll just get you better results, hopefully.
Daniel has a question about color space transform tone mapping. If I compare DaVinci with luminance mapping on my output transform for DaVinci Wet Gamut Direct 709, I can see different behavior in some colors. For example, DaVinci mapping shifts red color within warmer yellows more towards the primary yellow, and the skin tones also change. Why is that?
Ooh, this is a fun thing to talk about. We're officially going to depart from day for night, or this only will sort of tangentially relate to day for night. This is a fun thing to discuss. Why is it that these different flavors of tone mapping in Resolve Color Management result in not only different tonality, but in different colors? So the easiest way to audition that, let's go to our color management here. Actually, I'm going to do it like this. Let's just turn, I'm using right now the same color management that I talk about in DaVinci Wide Gamut workflows in that series. Let's just try something here. I'm going to say bypass color management for a moment. And we're just going to do, let's zero this whole thing out. And I'm going to use a whole different form of color management than I normally talk about. But this is like the simplest form of color management I could possibly do. This image in its input state is red wide gamut RGB, red log 3G10. And I'm going to Rec 709 gamut 2.4. This is the simplest possible color management that I could perform inside of Resolve. And I'm going to set some max inputs and outputs like so. And figure out why everything looks super weird. Maybe it's not bypassing my entire stack. Let's just turn myself into DaVinci YRGB here at my color management for a moment. This just means, hey, Resolve, don't help me. Stop helping. Don't do anything. I'm going to do everything. So I'm going to hit save. And now I've got this sort of sensible, well, should have a sensible baseline. Oh, I know what I'm going to do. This is a fun tangent. If you are manually color managing in nodes, then it's important to go to your camera raw tab and make sure that you are decoding, not based on what the camera operator was decoding to, meaning camera metadata, but instead to the stock IPP2 color science that's going to unpack the image into a nice big fat high dynamic range, high color negative, like so. Now that I've done that, it's unpacking into what I've told this color space transform to expect, so I'm getting sensible results. Now, back to the question. The difference between luminance versus DaVinci mapping here in this color space transform, we may or may not even see a difference in this image because there's not a ton of different hues, certainly nothing in that kind of yellow register, or not much that we're referencing. But let's just look at our scopes. I'm going to kind of try to pop those out for you guys, maybe make them a little bit bigger, and look at the image as well and see if we perceive a shift. So here comes luminance mapping. Very, very subtle, right? But we don't need it to be a big shift in order to observe the, like nature of the question, which is like, why does a thing that's only supposed to affect tones or contrast or luminance, why is that affecting color? Why is that? Well, we could talk about that for an entire episode of grade school. And in fact, we have talked about it in prior episodes, but I'll give you the super brief version of things right now. If I turn my, let me turn my offset off here. I'm just going to turn lift left and gain right. I'm doing a big ugly adjustment right now. Look at my vector scope. I'm affecting saturation, aren't I? And it's difficult to tell, it's difficult to observe, but I'm actually not only affecting saturation, I'm affecting hue by doing this. Just by manipulating RGB channels, which is what we always do when we're color grading, I'm affecting hue. And to put a visual on it, and if this is overwhelming or blowing your mind, that's okay. Your brain could use the exercise. Don't feel bad if you don't follow all of this. I certainly didn't my first time. Instead of doing lift and gain, let's just do a quick curves adjustment. And let's say we're going to do kind of an S-curvy thing. Let's turn these splines off. I'm not loving that. And reset. So I'm just going to set a sort of nominal neutral point here. We'll say below that, we're going to go deeper. And above that, we're going to go higher. Something like that, okay? So when we are directly manipulating RGB channels, like I'm doing right now, anytime I'm going below unity, you can see my unity line right now, meaning no adjustment. Anytime I'm going below unity, I'm going to begin to collapse. My hues are going to begin to collapse toward my primaries, toward red, green, and blue. So near red is going to start to become more red. Yellow is going to start to become more green. Make sense? Up above, the opposite is true. As I increase this, I'm going to lose saturation, and my colors are going to collapse toward my secondaries. So orange is going to start to become more yellow than red, if that makes sense. That's just cooked into the nature of tone mapping. So this is something that we have to deal with in any color management framework, including like the Resolve color management. These luminance mapping versus DaVinci, first of all, these are black boxes, so we don't exactly know how they are scheming this tone mapping adjustment. But what we can infer from looking at those two different renderings in the vector scope is that they are engaging with some different combination of manipulating RGB channels versus manipulating an actual luminance channel that has been calculated from RGB. So that's a big, slippery subject to bite off, but it's something you can continue to explore. The reality is that simply manipulating your RGB channels, even if you only think you're adjusting contrast, you're not messing with balance or saturation, you are actually changing net saturation and you're rotating your hues as well. And if that makes you feel a little bit weird and like disoriented and unstable, it did me too. So that's okay. But that's why we are seeing a difference here in between luminance mapping and DaVinci. Now, which one is doing which and by what scheme, we don't actually know. So I can't give you an explicit answer. And I would put a big outer wrapper on all of this by saying you should just do lots of empirical testing and arrive, as I have, at what you think is generally a better fit for your image, and trust that underneath that, you have all the room in the world to grade through. You know, if your color space transform is netting you a bit more saturation or a bit more hue collapse toward red or yellow or whatever than you would want, then you can always compensate for that by eye upstream. And that's a reasonable compensation to make in my estimation, because that's most color management. And I could talk more about that, but I feel like that's plenty of a portion size for today. Let's take one more.
Okay, question from Jim. What are your views on diffusion, blur, and textures in Day for Night? When I see things like the running creek, the sharpness of the water highlights would either sell it or kill it.
Oh, that's interesting. I would say that any take I would offer would be, you know, just a creative take. I think that's something for all of us to sort of reach our own conclusions on. I would say in general, you know, I'll go back to my little diatribe that I mentioned earlier about greatest gains for least efforts. I love the idea of texture manipulation, and I will do it from time to time for sure. But greatest gains for least effort, texture manipulation, I want as much as possible to trust that to the lens and the camera that was used. I'm not going to be able to move that needle much. Like the difference between me doing the worst possible job ever, totally dropping the ball, totally screwing up through an act of commission or omission in terms of texture management, the gap between there and, oh my God, that's the best you could have possibly done with your texture management. It's not that big for me, in my opinion, in terms of like the different things that I can do to meaningfully impact the image in a way that is really going to have a huge effect on the end viewer. Texture is not one of those go-tos for me that's like, oh wow, I can really, really change the viewer experience here. Doesn't mean I never do it, but that's kind of my general answer, and it holds for Day for Night. But I think that's a sensible idea to say, oh, if I can kind of like bloom or soften my highlights a little bit, then maybe that would help sell a certain like dreamy, like moonlit aesthetic. I think that's a reasonable contention. It just comes down to the artist to come up with a rendering of that really works for them. So that's a great place to round out. We get to bring it home back to Day for Night. I hope you guys had fun talking about Day for Night this week. I enjoyed it. I hadn't thought about it for a while, but it's a big, fruitful, fun area to explore. And we can apply Day for Night intent when we're grading to images that were captured with that intent, or maybe images that weren't captured with that intent. And it's a really fun thing to play with. I actually just had, in a film I was grading, the reason I thought of this, when I did, is I had a shot that was shot night for night with tungsten sources. It was illuminated, so it wasn't just like a moonlit vibe. But there was one shot that they couldn't pop off, or that they realized they needed after the night shoot had wrapped, and they couldn't get back out there at night and throw up all the lights. So there's a single day shot in there that had to be matched in to the rest of the night shots. That was difficult. That was one of the more difficult things to sell that I've had to do in a while. And it probably still isn't perfect, but I started thinking about how can I marry this in and create a night look out of this day shot imagery? So it comes up, and it's fun to have some ammo and some tools and some ideas for it when it does, because it's something that does pop up. And if you're on the spot trying to think of it all right then, you're not going to get as good results as if you've got a little bit of a head start on it. If that makes sense. So hope you guys had fun. Go check out the PowerGrade that I've shared with you. The link is in the description for today's video. If you want to play around with it yourself and expand, improve, tweak on it, I'm more than happy to hear your thoughts on what you would want to add or how you ended up using it to good results. I think that would be great. Also, just as a reminder, we have opened the wait list for the next round of my Colorist Career Accelerator, which we're going to be running in October. Very limited slots available for that. We sold out in less than 17 hours for the summer session. 91% of those slots that got sold out were 2 people who were on that wait list. So even if you're interested, get on the wait list. You don't have to commit to anything. You don't have to buy anything today. But if you're interested, get on that wait list, because if you're not on that wait list, you stand a 9% chance of grabbing one of those slots. It's going to be a lot of fun. Gedalia, are you going to be there with me this time?
This time, absolutely.
Yeah, you're going to stick with me?
I figure I'll put in another round.
You see, what a mensch. Thanks, buddy. It's going to be a good time. We had a great time this summer, and I'm looking forward to doing it even bigger and better than last time. There's more information about the Colorist Career Accelerator that we'll be releasing, but the core intent is in the title. I want to take you from being a professional in another realm or an amateur colorist and get you everything you need to have a true professional practice and start billing clients really well for really good work. That's my goal for the Colorist Career Accelerator. We spend 4 days focused on nothing but that agenda. It's a blast. I hope to see all of you guys there, but go check out that wait list if you are interested in hearing and learning more in the coming weeks. Thank you guys very much. Thanks for giving me a couple extra minutes of your time this morning. I appreciate it. We'll see you next week for a new pre-recorded video and a new grade school on Friday. Everyone have a great weekend. Bye-bye.